Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Neena Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host Neena Mishra. My guest today is Brad Lonkar, CEO of Lonkar Investments. Brad is a biotech expert. He created the indexes for the cancer immunotherapy ETF and the China biopharma ETF. Brad, welcome back on the show.
Hey, Neena, it's great to be back.
Okay, so let's start with the coronavirus, which has already killed about 500 people, which is mainly in China. And the virus has also infected more than 24,500 people across 25 countries. And Gilead is reported to be working with Chinese authorities to conduct a clinical trial of its drug remdesivir, and Johnson & Johnson, Glaxo, they are also reportedly working on coronavirus vaccines. And some small and mid-sized companies like Moderna, Novavax, and Nanoviricides, they also announced they are working on new treatments for the virus. And in fact, their shares have been quite volatile. And I understand that it takes a lot of time to get these treatments approved and then make it to the market. So do you think any of these companies could benefit from these treatments, and should investors look at all at them?
Yeah, I'm very cautious about all of this. This is certainly a humanitarian crisis and a very sad news event. Mm-hmm. But I would be very careful about following it from a biotech stock event. People who have been around biotech for a while have seen this story happen more than once. And the last time that we went through this on this scale was the Ebola crisis.
Right.
And, a lot of companies put out press releases back then saying they were working on something. Ironically, many of the same companies that are doing it today. And it eventually all faded away. And in fact, I think we have a case study to look at here. There was one company back then that did, in fact, have what ultimately turned out to be a successful vaccine for the Ebola crisis, and that is Newlink Genetics. So I would recommend that people take a look at that stock chart. There's two things I'd say about it. First of all, the Ebola vaccine was just approved a month ago, 5 years later. That's how long it took for that one to be developed. Mm-hmm. And Newlink stock over the course of that time went from the mid-40s to now $1 and change. Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. And what I think that tells us is that science takes a long time. And for these events, while they're the news of the day, they're very rarely big money makers. People think there's billions at stake here, and usually that's not the case. If you're going to look at this in general, number one, I think it's a great, these are the times where the biotech industry really puts its best foot forward. This problem needs to be solved through science, and it is great to see a lot of great companies, especially the larger ones like the Gileads and AbbVies of the world, really jump into this. So I think it's it could be a feather in the cap for our entire industry to figure out something that improves the situation. But from an individual stock play, I'd be very careful. If you're watching it, really the way to think about this is there some company out there where if they do succeed with either a vaccine or a therapeutic, that it might validate a wider technology platform. So if you're going to focus on stocks in that way, that's the way I would think about this. It may not be a big revenue stream or moneymaker for a company, but it validates their scientific prowess, and especially maybe a technology platform that hasn't been validated yet, it's still experimental, then a company like that can, benefit from contributing to, hopefully solving this one day.
Makes a lot of sense. And now let's talk about biotech stocks and ETFs in general. Biotech stocks were very hot in 2019, particularly in the fourth quarter. And in fact, I looked at the longer term performance as well. The equal weighted biotech ETF, which is the SPDR S&P Biotech ETF with the ticker symbol XBI, that was one of the top performing ETFs of the last decade. Now, in 2020, there are some concerns about political rhetoric. So, what do you think lies ahead for biotech stocks and ETFs in 2020?
Yeah, well, for full disclosure, I'm a biotech investor, so
Yes.
I'm always going to be bullish. But you're right. It's the sector as a whole had quite a decade, and I'm very optimistic over the longer term. I always think that months or even 1 year is a short time to predict, but the thing that fueled that performance that you're talking about is science.
Right.
And there's a lot of exciting things that are happening in science today that are truly pushing medicine forward, like gene therapy, like cancer immunotherapy, and other things like that. And I think the exciting thing is these things are becoming real. Like gene therapy is not science fiction. There's gene therapies approved in the U.S. There was one for a type of blindness and now one for a terrible disease called spinal muscular atrophy. Immunotherapy drugs are on the market today. And I really think for these technologies, as exciting as they are, we're really in version 1.0 of them. And I do think that researchers and companies will improve on them. And I think that, I kind of feel like the last couple of decades belong to tech, and I think the next couple ahead of us belong to biology. And so I think that, I think that really at the end of the day, what determines the fundamentals of this industry is the underlying science, and I've never been more excited about it than ever. So, with my biased biotech investor hat on, I'm very bullish over the coming years.
Yes, I agree with you. There's always rising need for innovative healthcare solutions, and we have seen so many very encouraging, very innovative solutions. And one reason why biotech did so well last year was M&A. We saw so many, big pharma companies acquiring smaller, innovative biotech companies. And in fact, according to Ernst & Young, they were $357 billion in life sciences deals last year, which was an all-time record, surpassing the previous high in 2014. Do you think M&A activity would continue in 2020 as well?
Well, I sure hope so. That's what really catches everyone's attention. I thought you had a really interesting comment when you said 2019 was a great year, especially the fourth quarter. It really was a story like that really made biotech's year. For the first few quarters, things weren't looking so hot. Biotech was really underperforming the rest of the sector, and it was M&A that I think turned things around. Novartis bought a company called the Medicines Company, and we saw a couple other deals towards the end of the year that really caused the sector to catch up and then some. And I do think we're going to see a lot more because over this year, because companies are actually kind of saying it. So, for example, Eli Lilly said they expect to spend billions of dollars per quarter. Sanofi bought a company called Synthorex at the end of last year, and it's really their way of trying to catch up in cancer, which they lost ground in over the last few years. And so companies have been pretty openly committal to doing deals. Now, most of them are describing them as bolt-ons, but that's fine, though, because it's rare to see a big Bristol Biogen type deal. Those tend to be once every few years at best type variety. And I personally focus on middle and smaller cap companies, and those are the ones that seem to be getting bought up. So I think that's a good thing.
Now, one very encouraging news last year was regarding Biogen's Alzheimer's drug, which reportedly showed some reduction in clinical decline in patients with early Alzheimer's. And in fact, there are currently no drugs approved by the FDA that can reverse the mental decline from Alzheimer's. So this would be a very anticipated, news of 2020. What are your thoughts? Do you think the FDA would approve Biogen's drug?
Yeah, so this is definitely shaping up to be the biggest news event, at least that we know of, or that we can expect of the year for biotech. Everyone knows what a sad thing and unmet need there is for a new Alzheimer's medicine. And this one is controversial. If you look back on the history of it, Biogen had a big trial, and they actually stopped it because for what we call futility, saying that it wasn't expected to have any chance to succeed.
Right.
And all of a sudden, they took a second look at it and said, "Wait a second, we see something here, and we're going to file." And so it's really a polarizing thing. There's some people that believe in this, and there's a lot of people that don't. So it's going to be a very big decision by FDA, and it's going to be a big news event for all of those reasons. It's hard to handicap because we saw some data at a conference late last year in San Diego, but we haven't seen the full picture. At least I haven't. I haven't seen enough data to really convince me to make a decision either way on this. So they haven't officially done the filing yet with FDA. We think that will be coming shortly. And it's going to be a big news event. And, Biogen, from being an ETF expert, it's such a big company that it has a big weighting in a lot of the market cap weighted biotech, ETFs. So the way that its stock goes can really have an impact on the sector more broadly. And also, this is such an important decision for FDA. It kind of will be a reflection on, is the FDA approval process getting stricter or looser? And that can affect the way that people think about our entire sector too. So it's a really big event for many reasons to follow, and it's can go either way. We'll have to see.
We'll definitely keep an eye on that. Now, another very encouraging news that I saw recently, it was reported that the cancer death rate in the United States dropped 2.2% from 2016 to 2017, which was in fact the largest single-year drop ever recorded. And that is according to the latest report from the American Cancer Society. And this was mainly due to great improvements in survival rates for lung cancer and melanoma. Now, we have seen that these biotech and pharma giants, they have been spending tens of billions of dollars on developing new therapies and new treatments. And according to the Wall Street Journal, the $123 billion global market for cancer drugs is among the industry's biggest and fastest growing. So could you please tell us about some of the encouraging developments in cancer treatment areas?
Sure. Well, you mentioned melanoma and lung cancer. That's immunotherapy.
Right.
That's the space that I focus on. If you went back as recently as 6 or 7 years ago, late-stage melanoma, there was nothing for, sadly. And these immunotherapy drugs, the first one was called Yervoy. That's what Jim Allison won the Nobel Prize for. And the second one there's a handful of them now, but Merck's Keytruda, Bristol Myers Squibb, Opdivo, those are called PD-1 inhibitors. Those have changed melanoma upside down. A lot, not all patients are responding to them, sadly, but the ones who do typically end up having long responses and are living with melanoma for years in some cases. So that's really changed things. And then a very similar thing is happening with lung cancer. Merck has data combining their immunotherapy drug Keytruda with chemotherapy that was really a game changer. And so this is an example of, one thing I say a lot is, I've been investing in biotech for a long time, and cancer medicines, one thing that had always been frustrating about them, and still is today, but a lot of cancer medicines in the past used to be very incremental.
Right.
They would extend people's lives by a couple of months. And over a very long time, that added up to a big thing. But these new technologies, like immunotherapy, are not incremental, especially for the patients who are responding to them. Mm-hmm. They're really rewriting how some types of cancers are being treated. And so it goes back to us, the science being real and delivering, real, real positive outcomes for a lot of patients. So it was great to see that. That's a headline that I think everybody saw. Those are the types of headlines that make the general news, not just the biotech news. And it's really great to see the fruits of labor of so many scientists and researchers who've made that happen.
Okay. So what are the key things you'll be watching in this area of immunotherapy in 2020?
So there's really three things that I'm watching closely, three different approaches to immunotherapy. One thing I remind people of a lot is you hear that word and you think of the immune system. It's important to know that there's a lot of different ways to go about this. Like immunotherapy drugs are not just one type, one size fits all. So one class that I'm watching closely this year is what's called bispecific antibodies. There's a class of bispecific antibodies called CD3s, and CD3 is a marker on the outside of T cells. So these bispecifics recognize a marker on the tumor cell and a marker on that T cell, and will kind of set the T cell off in the vicinity of those tumors. And they've had some toxicity issues, but people who will remember the initial journey of CAR-Ts will remember that CAR-T had some toxicity issues to begin with too, and companies eventually figured out how to handle it. And so I want to see if companies in the immunotherapy space will be able to do the same thing with CD3 bispecifics. Mm-hmm. Another thing that's going to be interesting is that bispecifics that are not CD3s, that have two unique targets, so like what's called PD-1, CTLA-4 bispecifics, we're going to start to see a lot of data from things like that this year. So it's kind of a space to watch. Okay. Another thing in cell therapy, so I mentioned CAR-T. So I think everybody remembers like Kite and Juno. Well, those are what's called autologous CAR-T, where the T cells that you use for that come from the patients themselves. And, on past podcasts, we've talked about how that's logistically challenging and very expensive. Well, hopefully the solution to that problem is what we call allogeneic cell therapy, which is using cells from donors. Now, that's a lot more challenging from a biology standpoint. And we haven't quite seen what I call the aha moment from allo data yet. When the first version of CAR-T came around, that aha moment, you saw data and you were like, whoa, this is going to change things. We haven't quite seen that from allo yet, but again, this is going to be a very data-rich year for this, just like with the bispecifics. You've got companies like Allogene that will be presenting data for the first time, Selectus, companies like that that are really working hard on this and are at the forefront of the science. So I'll be watching to see if there's an aha moment from allo data. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is what we call checkpoint combos. So these PD-1 inhibitors like Keytruda and Opdivo, companies have been trying to combine other drugs with them to see if, two things would work better than one. And we've started to see some nice successes. As I mentioned, Merck has succeeded combining Keytruda with chemotherapy. We've seen combinations with what we call ADCs, antibody-drug conjugates. Seattle Genetics and Merck had some good data in bladder cancer doing that. We've seen combos with something called TKIs. And what I want to see is unique IO, so immunotherapy plus immunotherapy combos start to show some compelling data. That hasn't quite happened yet, other than one combining with PD-1s with something called CTLA-4. So a lot of companies working on that space. The science is getting more refined and better over time, and we'll see if anything unique works out. We've seen some positive hints of data last year with companies that are focused on things other than T cells, like macrophages and other parts of the immune system. So those are the types of things I'll be watching. So we've got bispecifics, allo, cell therapy, and checkpoint combos.
Now, another area which has seen a lot of growth of late, and you mentioned that a little earlier, and that is gene therapies. And again, according to the journal, spending on gene therapies is projected to grow 25-fold between 2019 and the end of 2024. And you think that this year could be a big year for gene therapy. So tell us more about it.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest sign is that big companies are buying into it. Mm-hmm. So the first really big acquisition in the gene therapy space was Novartis buying a company called Avexis. So they have a gene therapy called Zolgensma that's for a terrible disease that infants have called spinal muscular atrophy. That was like an $8 or $9 billion deal. Biogen bought a company called Nightstar, and then a really big one, Roche, bought Spark Therapeutics. And then late last year, one of the things that kind of set Biotech off, a Japanese company, Astellas, bought a gene therapy company called Audentes. And so it's always a good sign, when the technology is as new and as different as gene therapy is, it's always a good sign when you see large pharmaceutical companies start to finally buy into it. I think this is those companies saying, we think this technology is real enough that we can't miss it. And there was actually a really important thing that happened at the end of last year. So I mentioned Roche bought this company, Spark, and the Federal Trade Commission, whenever a major acquisition happens, the FTC has to approve it. And they actually scrutinized this one a lot more heavily than we all expected. And it was because Spark is working on gene therapies for hemophilia, and Roche already has a big hemophilia drug called Hemlibra, and fortunately FTC ended up approving this, and I think that's a really important thing because the gene therapy hemophilias are not proven yet. Like, they haven't successfully completed phase 3 trials and all of that, and if the FTC got into the business of trying to handicap which drugs would succeed and which wouldn't, I think that would have not been a great thing, especially in an emerging field like gene therapy that's still kind of on the tipping point. If good news happens or bad news happens, it can really move the direction of this entire field. A couple decades ago, the gene therapy field was set back for decades because one patient died. So that's, how fragile sometimes these technologies can be. So I thought it was a positive thing that FTC went ahead and decided to approve this merger. And I think that's important because those types of deals kind of stopped. I think all other big companies that were in the same position as Roche were kind of wondering what was going on with that and wanted to see the outcome and whether it might affect the deal that they might have been, thinking about. And now that it's gone through, I think you'll see more large companies step up to the plate and partner or maybe even acquire gene therapy companies. But definitely an exciting field. So it's going to be a big newsmaker over the next couple of years, without a doubt.
Another area which I find very exciting is CRISPR, which is probably the best known gene editing technology. And according to my understanding, probably you'll be able to explain it better. My understanding is that CRISPR works like molecular scissors, which can be used to edit just one particular spot in the genome while avoiding unintentional consequences or changes elsewhere. And this was in news recently because the Chinese scientists who had created the world's first genetically modified babies using CRISPR was sentenced to 3 years in prison. So tell us a little bit about CRISPR and also your thoughts on the ethics of editing humans using CRISPR.
Yeah, I can start with the last part first. So
Yeah,
I
sure.
think it's the ethics have to be taken very seriously.
I
And
agree.
one of the major bugaboos where the Chinese scientists cross the line is doing what's called germline editing. So germline editing is essentially editing the genome of like a sperm or an egg. And the problem with that is that's something that, number one, needs to be tested in animals and, before the human stage much more extensively so we can better understand if there are downsides to that. You can have mutations and other unexpected things happen. And when you do that on the germline, it continues to other generations. So it's something that has to be taken very seriously. Trying to do something to, if a patient has a terrible genetic disease and you're using gene editing to try to solve that, that's one thing. But when this was way too experimental and unethical, so I think you have to take it very seriously. Mm-hmm. In terms of CRISPR, I kind of go back and forth on this from a stock market perspective. I worry sometimes that CRISPR has been drilled into the general public's head as a buzzword, sometimes a little too much. Sometimes I feel like people think it's going to cure every disease out there, and it's important to know, number one, how early we are in the CRISPR story, and number two, the challenges that are ahead. For example, there's one CRISPR stock, Intellia, has been a stock for almost 5 years now, and they haven't treated a single patient. They're going to file their first what we call IND supposedly sometime this year, maybe actually start a trial towards the end of this year. So these have been stocks that have not been based off of human trials, although those are starting to finally happen for the first time. But most of the CRISPR experiments that are happening right now is being done in what we call ex vivo. So they're using CRISPR to engineer CAR T cells and things like that. What's going to determine whether CRISPR or other gene editing techniques are as transformational as we hope they will be is, can you use CRISPR in the actual human body? And the most likely place, where all these companies will start, is the liver. into the human and to edit cells in human beings is a gargantuan task. I mean, biology is, don't underestimate how complicated human biology is. And so to deliver that and have it work and to be confident that there aren't other repercussions of that is a very big task. And, another thing I would say is that, number one, CRISPR is only one gene editing tool. Mm-hmm. There's something called Talon. There's something called Zinc Finger. There's something called Arcus. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the valuations for those technologies compared to the CRISPR companies is quite dramatically different. Another thing to keep in mind is that the companies that are out there today are version 1.0 of CRISPR. Mm-hmm. So, for example, there's a company that literally just is pricing an IPO tonight called Beam Therapeutics that's doing what's called base editing using CRISPR, which is kind of what I would consider version 2.0 of CRISPR. And so I think it's important. I am excited about CRISPR just like everyone else. And I do think it's, gene editing, period, is a great example of this new era of medicine that we're going into. But I would also caution people to dig a little deeper and really understand the dynamics of what CRISPR is in the broader context of gene editing and what this current version of CRISPR may look like compared to future ones, and who may benefit and who might not. We can oversimplify things sometimes, and I think sometimes in the stock market that's been done with CRISPR. So I would just make sure that people understand the technology, from all sides of it.
Okay, too many exciting developments in these areas, what you called the new era of medicines. I'm sure we'll talk again about those. Now, since I have you on the show today, I also wanted to talk quickly about Merck. It was reported this morning that Merck is spinning off about 90 products. These are mostly the slow growth products, and these will be spun off in a new company. What are your thoughts on that spin-off?
I have mixed feelings about this too. So I understand why they did it this way, but what investors have been wanting Merck to do for years is spin off their animal health unit, and that wasn't part of this. They're keeping that as part of whatever you want to call it, high-growth Merck. So that's a little disappointing. So I wasn't surprised to see the stock trade down like it is today. I don't think it's like a big deal, but I do think it's an incremental disappointment that they're doing this instead of spinning off animal health. Okay. Eli Lilly spun off their animal health unit, Elanco, a year or two ago, and that was very successful. Pfizer did the same thing with Zoetis years ago, and that was very successful. And I'm in the camp that Merck should do this too. The Ken Frazier and his team, which I think is maybe the best management team in the entire pharmaceutical industry. So, they deserve a lot of credit for decisions that they make. But so they'll argue that this is number one, that the animal health division is a growth division, which is true. And they'll argue that it's a good diversifying thing. Pharmaceuticals is out of favor, animal health may be in favor, and vice versa. But I just think it's weird. Like, I went to Merck had an R&D day in New York last year. It was like the first one they had in 5 or 6 years. And, it's weird. Like, one minute we're talking about Keytruda and cancer, and then they pivot to talking about fleas and ticks. It's just like very weird that that this business is tied into a human health business, and I do think it would unlock a lot of value if they had spun that out instead. So, I guess it's good that they're focused. They're gonna spin out what they consider their slow growth businesses, and really focus on cancer, which is my area of focus as well. We'll have to see how they do. They've earned, again, the management team is so good there that they've earned the right a long time ago to make their own decisions and not be overly second-guessed by people like me. But that being said, there are a lot of people out there that wish they'd taken a different tack with this. And so, they'll have time to prove all of us wrong. So, but it's a great company. I mean, Keytruda is, I think, the most important cancer medicine of, if not my lifetime, decades. I mean, it's really, last year it did $11 billion in sales, they announced this morning, which is just incredible. And again, I think we're in the very early stages of immunotherapy itself, and Keytruda is going to play a big central role in that, as it has. So Merck's going to be, I think, at the forefront and an exciting story to watch for a long time to come.
Right, I agree. That's all we have time for today. Brad, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Nina. We'll talk later.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about Brad's funds, please visit longcarfunds.com. Make sure to be on the lookout for the next edition of ETF Spotlight, and also make sure to subscribe. If you have any comments or questions, please email podcast@zacks.com.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.